Welcome to Reformed Thinking. So to start us off today, I want you to imagine something. Imagine it's Sunday morning. You've spent the entire week watching your own country get bombed on the evening news.
Yeah, just horrific stuff.
Right, just horrifying, completely unfiltered images of warfare on your screen every single day. Buildings that you recognize, places you drive past on your way to work, they are just reduced to rubble.
Utter devastation.
Yeah. And then you go to your local church, you sit in the pew, and the worship band strikes up this bubbly, aggressively happy pop song.
Which is, the standard for a lot of places.
Right. But in that moment, why does it feel so incredibly wrong? I mean, the music is positive, sure, but sitting there, it feels completely discordant. Where do you even turn for a vocabulary that actually matches that kind of real visceral grief?
And that is the exact tension we're looking at today.
Yeah, so for this deep dive, we're taking a really close look at a couple of theological essays that tackle this specific scenario. The whole mission here is to analyze how the Christian church worships and prays during times of massive geopolitical crisis.
Right, because the texts are focusing on the current Ukraine-Russia conflict, but they're processing it through a very specific, very ancient biblical lens.
Yeah, the language of communal lament and those heavy imprecatory psalms in the Old Testament.
That dissonance you brought up right at the start, the happy music while the world is burning, that's the focal point of the author's argument here.
It's the core issue.
Yeah. To set the stage, the main argument in these sources is that the modern visible church in the West is currently just paralyzed by a massive theological and liturgical crisis.
And the global warfare we're seeing has kind of pulled the curtain back on that, right?
Absolutely. The argument is that decades of, pragmatic, consumer-driven ministry, it's basically stripped the visible church of its structural theology.
Because the goal has been totally different for so long.
Right, you have these contemporary, seeker-sensitive evangelical churches, and they've designed their entire Sunday experience to be user-friendly, upbeat, entertaining.
Which means they had to leave some stuff out.
They did. They replaced the weighty, sovereign-centered doctrines with what the authors call an aesthetic of sentimental mysticism.
Sentimental mysticism. Let's stop and unpack that for a second, because that sounds like a seminary term. But I think it describes something most of us have felt,
Oh, for sure. It's very common.
When you think about this consumer-driven model,
Yeah.
The goal is basically to keep people comfortable. You want to bring people in, give them a really positive emotional experience, and just send them out feeling good about their week.
Right, it's very therapeutic.
Yeah, the music focuses on individual feelings. It almost treats God like a cosmic boyfriend who just wants to make you happy.
Which is a huge problem when real trauma hits.
I always think about it like a hospital. Imagine you walk into the intensive care unit, right? You have patients dealing with agonizing realities, life or death situations, extreme physical trauma.
It's a heavy, heavy environment.
And then over the hospital loudspeakers, management decides to play nothing but cheerful, bouncy pop music.
Just completely ignoring the reality of the room.
Right. They completely ignore the suffering taking place right in front of them. And the music doesn't fix the trauma. It just makes the people suffering feel, isolated, because the environment refuses to acknowledge their pain.
That analogy tracks so well with what these texts are critiquing. The authors are breaking down the mechanics behind this crisis.
What's the root cause, in their view?
They point out that this pragmatic approach to ministry, it actually led to the deliberate abandonment of the sotar in corporate worship.
Like they just stopped singing the Psalms entirely.
Pretty much. Over the last few decades, the modern church has largely just abandoned the disciplines of communal lament and imprecatory prayer.
And for anyone listening, imprecatory prayers are those specific, really intense cries for divine justice against wickedness, right?
Right. Those are the ones where the psalmist is asking God to judge the wicked. But because those minor key notes of Scripture were banished, just to keep the environment positive, the authors argue the modern church only has empty therapeutic platitudes left.
They don't know how to confront absolute evil.
No, they don't. You can't just offer a motivational speech when artillery is literally shaking the ground. When tyrants are trampling the innocent, the church desperately needs a vocabulary that lets it weep with those who weep and to actually cry out for divine justice.
Without that biblical vocabulary, they just retreat into silence or, neutral indifference.
Which is devastating for the people actually suffering.
Let me push back on that, though, because I can hear someone listening to this and saying, but wait, isn't a church gathering supposed to be an encouraging place?
Sure, that's a fair question.
Like, if someone has had a terrible week, if the news cycle is incredibly dark, why would a congregation want to sing depressing minor key songs on a Sunday morning? Shouldn't the goal be to lift people's
To
spirits?
give them hope, yeah.
Right. If I'm bringing a non-believing friend to church, I want them to feel welcomed, not bogged down in all this heavy grief.
And the sources, they actually anticipate that exact tension.
So how do they answer it?
The answer they provide is that true corporate worship does not pretend the world is unbroken.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, the authors reference historical principles of faith, specifically stuff aligned with the Westminster Confession, though they're speaking broadly, which stress that the whole counsel of God is necessary.
You can't just pick the hits.
Right, it's necessary for faith, for life, and for the proper execution of corporate worship. You can't just pick and choose the happy parts of Scripture.
Because bypassing grief doesn't actually cure it.
No, it just results in a really shallow framework. If you ignore the reality of human depravity and the suffering it causes, you produce a congregation that literally cannot fulfill the biblical command to weep with those who weep.
They wouldn't know how.
Exactly. I mean, absolutely.
Right.
You produce a congregation that doesn't know how to cry out to a sovereign God for justice. If worship only focuses on upbeat encouragement, it leaves believers stranded when they encounter atrocities that demand a wholly serious response.
You need the full spectrum of biblical vocabulary to handle the full spectrum of human experience.
Yeah.
You can't heal a deep wound by just slapping a smiley face sticker over it.
You really can't.
So it strikes me that if the modern church has lost this vocabulary, they must have had it at some point, right? Where did the authors go looking for it? Did they point to a specific moment where the historical church actually knew how to handle this kind of trauma?
They did. To understand this biblical language of war, the texts anchor the whole discussion in the summer of 586 BC.
Okay, 586 BC.
Yeah, this is the historical anchor for everything they argue. We're talking about the Neo-Babylonian Empire, commanded by King Nebuchadnezzar. They laid siege to Jerusalem and completely destroyed Solomon's temple.
We really need to spend some time on this because it's so easy to read a date like 586 BC and just, gloss over it as ancient history.
Just a fact in a textbook.
Right. But let's visualize what was actually happening on the ground there. We are talking about a brutal, prolonged siege. People were starving inside the city walls for months. And then the walls are finally breached.
We really have to grasp the massive scale of this catastrophic event. This wasn't just a standard military defeat or some simple border dispute.
It was everything.
For the Old Covenant people of God, the summer of 586 BC was a cosmic crisis. We have to understand what the temple actually represented to them.
It wasn't just a religious building.
Not at all. It wasn't a community center. The temple was the visible footstool of Yahweh on earth. It was the absolute focal point of the whole sacrificial system and the physical manifestation of God's covenant dwelling among his people.
So when it falls...
When the Babylonian forces breached the walls and burned the temple to the ground, it meant the daily sacrifices ceased entirely. The priesthood was completely scattered.
And the monarchy, too.
Right, the Davidic monarchy, which held the promise of an eternal throne, was seemingly cut off forever. And the authors point out that, according to the covenant warnings found back in Deuteronomy 28, this destruction was actually the execution of God's sovereign decree.
Because of the nation's apostasy?
Yes, because of their systemic, unrepentant apostasy, God brought the foreign sword against them. Babylon in this context was basically acting as the unconscious instrument of divine wrath.
And the visceral details the authors pull from this event are just horrifying. The text describes these pagan invaders acting with unprecedented savagery.
It was incredibly brutal.
They were actively mocking the name of Yahweh while destroying his city. But the detail that really stands out to me is how they treated the dead. The text notes that the bodies of the saints were left unburied.
Left in the streets.
Yeah, they were cast out as meat for the beasts of the earth and the birds of the air. And in the ancient world, denying someone the basic dignity of a grave, that was an act of extreme desecration.
It was the ultimate insult.
It was meant to completely humiliate the covenant people and erase their humanity. You're not just killing someone, you were treating them like roadkill.
And that historical desolation, that physical reality, that provides the raw material for the biblical lament.
Yeah.
You cannot separate the emotional weight of the poetry in the Psalms from the physical reality of the rubble.
They were writing this while looking at the ruins.
Literally, the ancient believers were looking at corpses in the streets and a burning sanctuary. And the authors draw a direct historical parallel between that ancient Babylonian invasion and the contemporary crisis in Ukraine.
Specifically, the escalation in 2022.
Right, the full-scale Russian invasion in February 2022.
So they're taking this ancient historical reality from 586 BC and just mapping it directly onto the modern geopolitical landscape.
Yes, shifting from the ancient Middle East right over to modern Eastern Europe.
What are the specific connections they're making there?
The texts provide some very specific statistics and arguments to build this parallel, and I'll just report their findings directly here.
Sure.
The authors state that since the full-scale invasion, over 400 Baptist and Reformed churches in occupied territories have been closed, vandalized, or completely liquidated by Russian forces.
400. That is a staggering number.
It is. And they detail how the Kremlin, working alongside Patriarch Kirill and the state-controlled Russian Orthodox Church, they framed this invasion as a holy war.
So it's not just political, it's explicitly religious.
According to the sources, yes. The narrative pushed by those state and religious leaders deliberately targeted non-Orthodox Protestant congregations. They labeled them as foreign threats.
And what happens to the people in those churches?
The texts report that Baptist and Reformed pastors have been arrested, kidnapped, and in some horrific instances, executed. The congregations have been forced to go totally underground just to escape the state-sponsored terror.
So what does a liquidated or underground church actually look like on a practical level today? We're talking about people who can no longer meet in their buildings.
No, the buildings are gone or seized.
They are gathering in basements, whispering hymns so the authorities don't hear them, knowing that if they are found, their pastors could just be taken away.
It's terrifying.
When you connect those historical dots, you really see the ancient Babylonian mockery of Yahweh mirroring the modern state-sponsored terror against Protestant congregations that the authors are outlining here.
The parallels are very stark.
In 586 DC, Babylon used military dominance to crush the people, mocking their faith and desecrating their holy places. Today, the text argues, we see a lawless power utilizing military force to crush congregations, shuttering buildings, and framing it all as a holy crusade.
Which proves the author's point.
Right. It shows that the physical suffering of the visible church under armed tyranny is not just some relic of the ancient past. It is a recurrent historical reality. And because it keeps happening, the modern church desperately needs the ancient vocabulary designed to process it.
And that ancient vocabulary is preserved in the literary architecture of the Psalter.
Let's dig into that architecture.
The authors argue that the biblical response to these specific kinds of atrocities is found in Psalm 79. But they offer a massive caution here.
Okay, what's the warning?
You cannot read Psalm 79 in isolation. You have to look at its canonical placement. Psalm 79 resides in Book 3 of the Psalms, which covers Psalm 73 through 89.
Why does that specific section matter?
Well, this section of the Hebrew hymnal was largely written by temple worship leaders, specifically the sons of Asaph and Ethan the Ezrahite. When you compare Book 3 to Books 1 and 2, you see a massive thematic shift. The first two books focus heavily on the personal triumphs, struggles, and individual prayers of King David. But when you arrive at Book 3, the focus shifts entirely to corporate identity and national tragedy.
So it zooms out from the individual to the whole nation.
Yes. The massive theological tension running through this entire section is this. How can God's covenant promises to David stand firm when pagan nations are actively overrunning the inheritance of the Lord?
That structural context is fascinating. You're looking at a curated hymnal, and the placement of the songs actually tells a story.
The arrangement is very intentional.
I noticed the specific placement of Psalm 79. It doesn't just float out in space. It sits squarely between Psalm 78 and Psalm 80.
Which is key.
Right, because Psalm 78 is a massive, lengthy historical recital of Israel's persistent unfaithfulness, their rebellion, their idolatry across multiple generations.
It's a heavy indictment.
And then you have Psalm 79, which is this raw cry from the ruins of the destroyed city, and that is followed by Psalm 80, which is a plea for God to restore his people.
That sequence is everything.
But let me ask a hard question here based on that exact placement. If Psalm 78 is all about Israel's historical rebellion and systemic sin, and it sits right before the lament over the destruction of the city, does that mean the authors are saying the Babylonian invasion was the Israelites' own fault?
The authors would say yes. That is the theological point they're making.
Really?
Yeah, the authors stress that the covenant community cannot approach Psalm 79 with a spirit of moral superiority. They can't act as if they are innocent victims of just some random tragedy.
Because of the context of Psalm 78.
Right. Because of the historical reality established in Psalm 78, the community has to enter into the lament of Psalm 79 with a deep awareness of their own corporate guilt. The Babylonian invasion was, from a covenantal perspective, the bitter fruit of their own historical rebellion against the law of God.
So they have to own their part in it.
They do. The text warns that isolating Psalm 79 from this canonical context is incredibly dangerous. If you just rip it out of its literary environment, you risk turning its heavy, imprecatory petitions into a license for personal, sinful hatred or carnal vigilantism.
You just become self-righteous.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But when you read it in context, recognizing the corporate guilt of the people, it becomes a holy tool. It allows the community to process their raw grief and outrage without falling into that self-righteous victimhood.
Wow, that changes the entire tone of the psalm. It isn't just angry shouting, it is a highly structured, deeply theological response to trauma.
It's very precise.
The sources take us on an exegetical deep dive into the Hebrew text of Psalm 79 to prove this, don't they? They break the psalm down into distinct grammatical and thematic sections. Let's look at the beginning, where the psalmist establishes the reality of the cruelty.
Yeah, the first few verses describe the horrific reality of the pagan invasion. And the authors analyze the specific Hebrew vocabulary Asaph uses to make his point here.
What are the key words?
Well, in verse 1, the psalmist says the nations have come into God's inheritance. Asaph deliberately avoids the most common Hebrew word for land, which is eretz.
Okay, why does that matter?
If he'd used eretz, this would just be a secular political complaint about losing national territory, a border dispute. Instead, he uses the word nachala, which translates to God's private estate or inheritance.
Oh, wow.
Right, he is framing the invasion as a direct assault on God's personal domain. The invaders didn't just cross a geopolitical border, they violated the holy boundaries of King Yahweh.
It makes it a theological issue, not just a political one.
Exactly. I mean, spot on. Then the text points out the verb taimu, which means to defile or render ceremonially unclean. The pagans didn't just break the physical stones of the temple, they insulted the holiness of God himself.
The distinction between eretz and nachala is huge. Think about it this way. If someone trespasses on the far edge of your property, your front lawn, that is a violation.
Sure, you'd be mad.
You would be upset, you'd call the police. But it is a very different thing if an intruder breaks into your actual house, smashes into your sacred family vault, and starts destroying your most treasured heirlooms.
It's intimate.
Yes. The use of nachala shows this is a highly personal offense against God himself. It is an invasion of his living room, not just his zip code.
That is a great way to frame the severity of the word choice. And the exegesis continues into verse 3, where the authors highlight the intense, really biting irony of the Hebrew verb shahak, which means to pour out.
Pour out what?
The psalmist says the invaders have poured out the blood of the saints like water. To really understand this, we have to understand the Levitical system.
Right, the Old Testament law.
In that system, blood was sacred. It represented life. It was meant to be carefully collected and poured out at the base of the altar in holy worship to make atonement.
It had a very specific holy purpose.
But here, the lawless invaders treat the lives of God's covenant people with such utter contempt that their blood is splashed across the streets of Jerusalem as if it were just common, worthless water.
That is a chilling image.
It is. And this leads into the next section of the psalm, where the text pivots with a massive question. How long, Yahweh?
That pivot is so crucial because they move from describing the horror on the ground to looking up at the sky. They stop looking at the Babylonians and start looking directly at God.
And by asking, how long, Yahweh, the psalmist is recognizing the sovereign hand of divine providence in all of this.
Right. They know God is still in control.
He knows that Babylon is merely the physical rod of discipline. The final cause of the desolation is the burning jealousy of God against his people's sin.
Which goes back to Psalm 78.
Right. The psalmist is acknowledging that God is absolutely sovereign over the rise and fall of these empires. He governs all events by his holy decree. So instead of trusting in human strategies or political campaigns to fix it, the psalmist appeals directly to the divine counsel.
And that brings us to the actual petitions in the psalm. The people are crying out for vindication, but it's really interesting that they start with confession. Before they ask for their enemies to be judged, they ask for their own sins to be dealt with.
Yes. In verses 8 and 9, the people plead for swift mercy to meet their total exhaustion. They ask God to expiate or cover their sins.
So the Hebrew there.
The specific Hebrew phrase used is aut diskarlano, which means, remember not against us our ancestral sins. They're asking for deliverance from their covenant guilt.
Wait, let's break down expiation for a second. For anyone who isn't a theology major, what is actually happening mechanically when a sin is expiated? We use these big terms, but what do they mean on a functional level between a human and God?
Sure, expiation refers to the removal or the covering of guilt. In the Old Testament sacrificial system, when an animal was sacrificed, its blood was applied to the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
The idea was that the blood covered the broken law of God, satisfying God's justice so that he could look upon his people with mercy instead of wrath.
So it changes God's posture toward them legally.
Yes. When the psalmist asks God to expiate their sins, they are asking God to apply a covering over their guilt, to remove the legal penalty of their rebellion so that fellowship can be restored. They know they deserve the judgment they are experiencing, so they appeal to God's mercy to wipe the slate clean.
That makes a lot of sense. So once that foundation of repentance and expiation is laid, they move to the invitation for divine vengeance.
They do, and it's heavy.
They ask God to pour out his wrath upon the nations that do not know him. The authors note the imperative verb here is shepek, pour out.
Which matches the earlier word.
Right, it matches the earlier description of the shed blood, shafku. Because the heathen poured out the blood of the saints like water, the psalmist asks God to pour out his blazing wrath upon the heathen. The sources draw attention to the fact that this is a petition for perfect, symmetrical justice.
It is symmetrical, and this is key. It is entirely handed over to God. Every single verb related to vengeance in these petitions is either a passive verb or an imperative command directed strictly at God.
Wait, so the people aren't asking to do it themselves?
Not at all. Human agency is completely removed from the execution of justice here. The worshiper is not asking God to hand them a sword so they can take revenge.
They aren't asking for a violent revolution.
No vigilante uprising. They are taking their raw, very real desire for justice, and they are handing the gavel back to the heavenly judge.
I want to highlight how psychologically brilliant that is. When you have been deeply wronged, the anger inside you needs somewhere to go.
It has to go somewhere or it destroys you.
Right. If you just suppress it and pretend everything is fine, like we talked about with the happy church music, it turns into bitterness and eats you alive. But if you act on it yourself, you become a monster. You become just like the people who hurt you. Handing the gavel to God is really the only way to process the anger without letting it destroy you.
That's a great insight, and it leads directly into the final movement of the psalm, which is the doxology in verse 13. The psalm concludes with a vow. We, thy people and sheep of thy pasture, will give thee thanks forever. We will show forth thy praise to all generations.
So it ends on praise.
Yes, and the authors argue that this proves the final goal of deliverance is not secular national pride or temporal comfort. The church doesn't beg for rescue just so they can go back to living comfortable, easy lives.
It's not just about getting their stuff back.
No, the reason they want to be saved is to preserve an unbroken, generation-spanning doxology. God delivers his people so they can remain a visible, worshiping assembly that proclaims his glory.
Building on that structural and exegetical breakdown, the sources advocate for the recovery of these imprecatory prayers in the modern church.
They think it's vital for today.
They argue that praying for the defeat or destruction of wicked tyrants is a holy and necessary act of worship, especially in wartime. This directly confronts a lot of modern pacifist trends in the church today.
It certainly does.
But I have to ask the hardest question, the one that immediately comes to mind for a lot of listeners. How does praying for a sevenfold vengeance upon your enemies align with New Testament commands?
Right, the Sermon on the Mount.
Jesus says to love your enemies and bless those who persecute you. The Apostle Paul talks about overcoming evil with good. Doesn't Psalm 79 contradict the New Testament ethic?
It's a massive question.
Yeah.
And the sources address that tension head on. They synthesize an answer using the New Testament itself. They point specifically to Romans chapter 12.
What does Paul say there?
Paul commands non-retaliation, telling believers to bless their persecutors and not to avenge themselves. But the reason he gives for this command is crucial. He quotes the Old Testament. "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord."
Oh, so the prohibition against private vengeance depends on God doing it instead.
Yes. The prohibition against private vengeance depends entirely upon the reality of divine vengeance. By praying the imprecatory psalms, the church is actively surrendering all private vigilantism and personal revenge to the court of heaven. Christian patience is not a denial of justice. It is a submission to God's perfect timing and execution of justice.
So praying these psalms is actually the mechanism that allows you to obey the command not to take revenge.
That's the argument, yeah.
You are giving the anger to God so you do not act on it yourself.
Mhm.
Because if you don't believe God will actually execute justice, you will feel forced to do it yourself.
That is right. And the texts clarify how these prayers should be directed. They argue that imprecation must target specific wickedness. For instance, commanders ordering atrocities or rulers persisting in bloodshed.
Not just everyday people.
No, a congregation should not invoke indiscriminate suffering on an entire population. At the same time, these prayers must be joined with intercession for the conversion of the enemy.
Praying for their salvation.
Right. The authors note a crucial point. A Christian seeks the enemy's highest good, which is salvation, while simultaneously refusing to make the safety of the victims dependent upon the enemy's willingness to change.
That's a vital distinction.
You can pray for a tyrant's heart to be changed by the gospel, while also praying that if they refuse to repent, God would swiftly break their power and stop their violent actions.
That requires a level of theological nuance that you just do not get from a simple, upbeat pop song. You are holding two massive realities in tension: the desire for the perpetrator's salvation and the absolute demand for the victim's protection and vindication.
It's a heavy theological lift.
And the sources insist that this entire framework only holds together if we look at the fulfillment of Psalm 79 in the New Testament.
Yeah, the authors are adamant that reading Psalm 79 without seeing its connection to Jesus Christ misses the whole point of biblical theology.
How does Christ fulfill this specific lament?
They argue that Jesus is the true and greater temple. He is the localized dwelling place of divine glory. When you look at the crucifixion, you see the ultimate lawless invasion.
The destruction of the temple.
Right. The Roman soldiers, the Goyim, they mocked, stripped, and physically defiled the body of the Son of God.
Yeah.
His blood was poured out outside the gates of Jerusalem. On the cross, Jesus stood as the ultimate corporate sufferer.
The linguistic connections the authors draw here are just staggering to me. They point out that the burning jealousy of God's wrath, the chama that Psalm 79 begs God to pour out upon the ungodly nations, that wrath was instead poured out upon Jesus.
He took the head.
He absorbed the full weight of the imprecation that his people actually deserved. He satisfied the penal demands of the broken covenant. And the chilling echo the texts highlight is from Psalm 79, verse 10, where the pagans ask, "Where is their God?"
Such a mocking question.
That is the exact mockery shouted at Jesus while he hung on Calvary. The religious leaders literally looked at him and said, "He trusts in God, let God deliver him."
It's a direct parallel. And the text argues that this fulfillment stretches even beyond the cross to the second coming. The authors refute the modern presentation of a Messiah who is just sort of indifferent to sin.
A passive Jesus.
Right. They push back on that. They point to Revelation 6.10, where the martyred saints beneath the heavenly altar cry out with a voice that directly mirrors Psalm 79. They cry out, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood?"
The martyrs in heaven are praying imprecatory prayers.
Yes, they are. And the text asserts that Christ will return as a conquering king to execute the fullness of these imprecations upon the unrepentant. The return of Christ proves that God's patience during this present era is not moral indifference. He will execute perfect retributive justice.
With all of that massive theological and historical weight established, the texts finally move into practical application. They provide specific directives for how the modern church should actually conduct its worship and its prayer during times of global conflict, specifically looking at the situation in Eastern Europe.
Right, getting down to the practical level.
Because it's one thing to understand the Hebrew syntax of a psalm, but what does a church actually do on Sunday morning with this information?
Well, the texts outline 3 specific recommended actions for the visible church today. First, they argue that churches must restore the singing of minor key psalms of lament.
Getting them back into the hymnal?
Yes. They specifically list Psalms 13, 22, 44, and 79. The goal is to provide congregations with a biblically authorized vocabulary to express holy outrage against systemic evil. This proves that lament is actually a mark of deep covenant trust, not weak faith.
If you didn't trust God, you wouldn't bother crying out to him.
Exactly. Second, the authors state that pastors must lead in bold, specific intercession from the pulpit. The texts explicitly call for praying for the destruction of the Russian military machine and the exposure of the Moscow Patriarchate's false theology, which they argue basically covers expansionist slaughter with a veneer of Christian rhetoric.
Those are very pointed prayers.
Very pointed. But crucially, they state this must be paired with praying for the conversion of leaders like Vladimir Putin and his generals. The church must pray that God would either bring them to repenting faith or swiftly break their power.
And what's the third directive? I know it focuses on the victims on the ground.
Yes, the third application is to direct intense pastoral care, resources, and prayers to the persecuted Protestant remnant. The text specifically named the underground Baptist and Reformed congregations operating in occupied territories.
Supporting the people actually living through it.
Right. The authors call for the global church to support these localized, visible churches, praying that their physical lives be spared and their witness maintained in the midst of the desolation.
So, to summarize the practical application here, this entire framework allows the church to maintain a distinct, holy identity. The state bears the physical sword, but the church operates differently.
Completely different tools.
The church uses the word, the sacraments, and prayer. True compassion in a time of war requires telling the truth before a sovereign God, refusing to rely on shallow therapeutic models, and taking up the heavy vocabulary of Scripture.
Yeah, that's the core of their argument.
Let's look back at the big picture we've covered today. We started by looking at a modern church paralyzed by its own pragmatic design, unable to process the visceral shock of war because it only wanted to sing happy songs.
The sentimental mysticism.
Right. And then we saw how the heavy ancient vocabulary of the Psalms bridges the physical ruins of 586 BC Jerusalem with the contemporary ongoing crisis in Eastern Europe.
It bridges thousands of years.
The texts we analyzed argue that authentic worship does not require pretending everything is fine. It requires weeping with the broken, confessing our own corporate guilt, and trusting perfect justice to the hands of a sovereign creator.
It's a much more robust theology.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, something that builds on everything we have discussed. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt guilty for feeling angry about an injustice, this is what the authors are trying to address.
There's a place for that anger.
If the early church and the ancient authors of the Psalms relied so heavily on this specific language of communal lament to process massive national tragedy, what unresolved grief or what hidden, unspoken anxieties in your own community might be waiting for the language of lament to finally be voiced and handed over to a sovereign judge?